In 2001, Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer literally called Linux a cancer. He actually said open source software was a threat to intellectual property, totally incompatible with how a serious tech company operated. But then, flash forward to 2018. Microsoft buys GitHub, the largest open source platform in the entire world, for $7.5 billion. And by April 2019, they were briefly the most valuable company on the planet. I mean, that is just one of the most dramatic strategic reversals in the history of technology. And the playbook behind it? It applies to absolutely any company watching a platform shift the ground right beneath their feet. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into the Microsoft Azure story.
Section 1. The greatest strategic reversal. To really wrap our heads around how remarkable this turnaround was, you have to understand just how completely Microsoft had been left behind. For decades, Microsoft absolutely dominated tech by licensing proprietary software, right? Think Windows, Office, enterprise applications that you had to physically install on-premise. It was a model that generated extraordinary wealth, but man, it was clearly running out of road. And you know, the problem wasn't just the products, it was the culture itself. Microsoft had morphed into this fiercely Windows-centric organization, where literally every single decision was evaluated through one lens, protecting the Windows franchise. Mobile? Treated as just a Windows extension. The web? Viewed as a threat that needed to be neutralized. And developers, the actual people choosing which platforms to build on, they were increasingly treated as captives rather than partners.
Now contrast that super defensive posture with this number, $7.5 billion. That is the massive, jaw-dropping sum Microsoft dropped in 2018 to buy GitHub. This wasn't just some standard corporate acquisition. It was a total admission that their entire philosophy had to be rebuilt from the ground up.
Which brings us to Section 2, losing the platform shift. So when Amazon launched AWS back in 2006, they were years ahead of the game. Startups building on the cloud didn't even give Microsoft a second thought. I mean, why would they? They could just rent computing power from Amazon instantly with a credit card. Easy. But Microsoft? They were still trying to offer them these clunky on-premise licensing agreements that required a grueling corporate procurement process. It was like night and day.
And things didn't magically get better right away. When Azure finally launched commercially in 2010, the early reviews were, well, they were damning. One technology blogger literally wrote that the documentation was incomprehensible and that the interface was so incredibly difficult to use that Microsoft was going nowhere in their efforts to deliver a competitive alternative to AWS. Ouch. But you see, this wasn't just a small product bug. This was a giant company that had completely missed the defining platform shift of a generation. And that internal culture we talked about, the one that built the Windows empire, it was actively preventing the exact response that the moment required.
Let's move to Section 3, the origin of Azure. Now, the foundation for Microsoft's massive comeback had actually been laid years earlier. It happened quietly, internally, and honestly against some major organizational resistance. Back in 2005, Microsoft's chief technology officer, Ray Ozzie, wrote an internal memo that became pretty famous inside the company. He called it the Internet Services Disruption. His argument was blunt. The shift to internet services was fundamental, it was irreversible, and Microsoft was going to have to change its entire business model to survive it. That very memo led to Project Red Dog, an initiative that eventually evolved into Azure. But getting Azure through that organization, an organization whose entire identity, incentive systems, and massive profit margins were optimized for selling packaged software, that was a brutal fight against the company's own DNA. The real turning point came in 2011 when Steve Ballmer put Satya Nadella in charge of the server and tools business. Now, this was a $15.4 billion division responsible for the foundational infrastructure that enterprises ran on. Ballmer's instructions to Nadella were explicit: transform this division from an old-school on-premise licensing business into a cloud-first powerhouse. Nadella totally understood the assignment, and when he became CEO 3 years later, he took that exact mission and expanded it to the entire company.
Section 4. Nadella's radical turnaround.
When Satya Nadella officially took the reins as CEO in February 2014, he made 3 specific moves that completely defined the turnaround. Move 1. Reframe the mission. It became mobile first, cloud first. Not Windows first, not Office first. That declaration sent a crystal clear signal to everyone inside Microsoft that the hierarchy of priorities had permanently changed. If a product didn't serve mobile or cloud users, it was no longer at the center of the company's identity. Move 2. Reverse on open source. Now, this was the move absolutely nobody saw coming. Under Nadella, Microsoft announced that Azure would actually support Linux, and they started contributing heavily to open source projects. And finally, move 3. Partner and integrate transparently. Executing these 3 specific moves didn't just tweak Microsoft's strategy, it completely rewrote their DNA.
Which leads right into Section 5, embracing the open source.
Making this work required a massive psychological shift. Think about the pride they had to swallow. As Azure's chief marketing officer, Julia White, described it in 2019, just 5 years ago, it would have been unimaginable how open-source-oriented we would become. But we had to. Our heritage of closed technology put us in a bad spot, and we got a black eye from that. We learned our lesson and committed all in. It's pretty rare to hear a major tech executive be that incredibly candid about past failures.
And internal strategy documents really revealed the depth of this shift. Look at this. A staggering 76% favored a strategy to contribute more to open source, basically matching the ethos of competitors like Google. They realized they couldn't just sit back and take advantage of open source code. They actually had to build goodwill with developers by giving back to the community.
And, they backed it up with tangible actions. They didn't just talk the talk. They aggressively supported Linux on Azure. They launched Visual Studio Code and made it entirely open source across Windows, Linux, and Mac. And of course, when they bought GitHub, they preserved its community, strictly without forcing any Microsoft advertising into it. Basically, they proved to the world that their commitment wasn't just some clever PR spin.
Section 6, winning the cloud wars.
Because here's the thing. Making internal changes was really only half the battle. They still had to fight for market share against some incredibly entrenched competitors out in the real world. Just look at Kubernetes, which is an open-source container management standard. Instead of falling back into their old habits and building a closed alternative, Microsoft caught up by going natively side-by-side with AWS. They fully supported community-backed open-source service integrations right on Azure, giving developers this incredibly seamless, familiar experience.
But okay, let's be real for a second. We have to acknowledge the staggering scale of Amazon's lead here. By 2018, AWS was generating over $25 billion in revenue and over $7 billion in operating income. That's just massive. AWS was, and honestly in many ways still is, the existential threat that Microsoft constantly faces in the infrastructure space.
But you've got to balance that massive AWS lead with this totally undeniable fact. Today, over 95% of the Fortune 500 use Microsoft Azure. How? Well, Microsoft smartly leveraged their decades of corporate IT relationships. By taking existing enterprise accounts and identity directories and integrating them directly into Azure, they essentially made themselves the safest, most logical choice for big business transitioning over to the cloud.
And finally, the next platform shift.
Surviving the cloud disruption perfectly set the stage for the next massive era in tech: generative AI. Think about it. Training foundational models like OpenAI's GPT requires thousands of specialized GPUs running perfectly in parallel. The training costs literally run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. It requires exactly the kind of massive, highly scalable computing power that the Azure cloud was so painstakingly built to provide over the last decade. Which is exactly why Microsoft's deep, multi-billion-dollar partnership with OpenAI makes so much strategic sense right now. Microsoft spent the last 20 years completely reversing its corporate DNA. They went from a fiercely defensive, closed-source software monopoly to an open, cloud-first infrastructure powerhouse. But with artificial intelligence now fundamentally changing how the entire world queries and interacts with information, we have to ask, will Microsoft's hard-won agility be enough to survive the next great disruption? Thanks so much for tuning into this explainer.